Welcome to another episode of the Real Appreciation Podcast. I am your host, David Clair-Bennett, and today I have with me someone who loves the horror genre just as much as I do. He is a writer, director, producer, and the brainchild behind the highly anticipated upcoming horror comedy, New Year's Eve. He is PJ Starks.
How are you?
I'm doing well. Glad to hear you are too.
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good. Can't complain. Not too
Good.
much anyway.
There are a few things I wanted to open up and talk to you about. And don't worry, we will definitely be speaking about your upcoming horror movie, New Year's Eve, as you can see in the background.
Yep.
Signed too, right?
Shameless plug. Yeah, this is actually the teaser poster, and we had it signed by some cast crew. Like there's Dave Sheridan, Felissa's on here somewhere right there. So it's a whole bunch of different people.
That's amazing. And don't worry, we will be getting into New Year's Eve. But before we get into that, I think it's really important to talk about your other work as well, such as not just being in one field in this industry, as your IMDb can tell us, because you're not only a writer, but you also direct and produce. Now, PJ, talk to me about how your approach may change when you're wearing the hat of a writer, director, and producer in the same production, for example.
I mean, obviously, when you're donning several hats during the same production, there is a lot of crossover. I would say, if anything, I'm producer first. And because by the time we get to the production side of things, everything has kind of been worked out through, or a majority of it anyway, story wise through pre-production. So uh, having written a story and then turning around and having to see it to fruition, by the time that we get to that point, I already kind of know what our limitations are going to be. So there's really not a whole lot of back and forth, like with me and Eric. Eric Huskisson is my producing partner. So like by the time we're on set, there's never a moment where it's like, okay, well, we have to make a compromise here. I mean, that compromise has pretty much already been made in advance, because we know maybe it's something that we couldn't pull off, or the story had already been adjusted, or dialogue had been adjusted. Um, so going back to what I was saying, I'm always a producer first, in the sense that it's a lot of problem solving. It's a lot of logistics that have to be taken care of while you're on set. And then, of course, when in the situation, like with New Year's Eve, or my segment that I did in 13 Slaves Till Christmas, where I was directing, if I'm directing and producing, once again, lots of crossover there. Um, so I don't know if my approach is necessarily different. If anything, I would say that, anytime I'm on set or we're on set, we're super laid back, and we try to make the experience as fun and but professional as we can for everybody involved. And I'm real big on collaboration. So anytime I do something, I'm always either asking other people like, hey, what are your thoughts about this? Or even, if somebody has a suggestion. And I always tell everybody on set, typically we have a meeting, we meet with everybody before we start, and we say, look, if you have an idea, throw it out there. If we have time to do it, we'll definitely take advantage of that. And that's one of the things. Like, I'm also the editor a lot of the time. So I know going into it that if somebody has an idea and it turns out to be much better than what was there initially, then it would be stupid for me not to take that idea, because at the end of the day, it's about making the final product better. And plus, when it comes to the editing side, I like to have options when I get into the editing room, because something may not work, and then I go, well, let's see what it's like with whoever's idea, and then put that into place, and then suddenly you're like, oh, this works perfectly, and then that just made the movie that much better.
What challenges do you tend to face, like a lot of times whenever you're making the film, like any of your films, and how do you overcome those challenges?
I mean, I would say, a lot of the times the biggest challenge is financing. um from a writing standpoint, you write what you know. And then I've got a lot of contacts like in the community of Owensboro, and of course Eric also has some contacts. So we know that, like, if I'm going into a story that I'm writing, I know that I have access to this kind of location or that kind of a location. So I know I can write that into the story, and then we can work out those details once we get to the that part of the pre-production. But I would say a lot of the biggest hurdles have definitely been financial. Because every time we do a project, we want to make it a little bit bigger and a little bit better every time, and there's really no point in doing something if you're not trying to improve, whether it's through storytelling or the visual aspect or kind of all of the above. Um, and I personally don't like to stay stagnant. We're always, I like to try to do something different. We did pretty much any of our projects, if you look at them, from Volumes of Blood to the sequel to 13 Slaves Till Christmas and now New Fear's Eve, they're not exactly the same. They feel different. The quality is better each time. Um, so I would say, knowing that we're going into whatever the next project is going to be, and that it's going to come with those financial hurdles, because we are going to need bigger special effects or more people involved, or of course then there's always unforeseen things, so you want to be able to have a little bit kind of set to the side in case something pops up, and unfortunately you have to like throw some money at it in order to get it to go away. That happens too. um so so it's definitely, I would say, financial. And then for the longest time, we had an issue with trying to get local support. And I've been doing this even before Eric and I partnered up. I've been doing this since 2008 seriously. And it's when you're doing horror films in the Bible Belt, a lot of the time you either can't get someone to take you seriously, especially because you're an independent filmmaker, or it's something where maybe they want to support it, but because of the genre, it's not something that they particularly want to be involved with. However, I noticed we had an unprecedented amount of support for our newest project. And it's going to be really weird. And I don't know where you fall on this, and I won't reach, but um, I noticed that changed after I got saved. So I don't know how you feel about that or anybody else. I get people looking at me saying, "Hey, you're crazy," but I noticed a huge difference when things changed for me spiritually. So I kind of give a lot of the credit, I would say, to God on that, because by His grace, I mean, ultimately we got this insane amount of support, and that all happened after the fact. And I mean, if you look at the amount of people that we worked with on our newer project, from the Convention and Visitors Bureau, Wesleyan, uh, Kentucky Wesleyan College, which is a private Methodist school, Owensboro Community Technical College, the Owensboro Police Department, River Park Center, Owensboro Symphony Orchestra, Famous Bistro, pub on Second Street. I mean, it goes on and on and on. I think if you look at even if you look at the trailer for the film, you can just see that it's bigger in scope and grander in a much larger way than what our previous projects have been. So it was uh it was definitely finding ways to try to overcome that support, and I feel like in some ways that was things changing for us professionally, but also changing in other ways. And hopefully moving forward, that support will continue, because I know that we're definitely going to be doing our next project, and we already have an idea of what it's going to be, and it's definitely going to be something that's once again bigger and better in scope and in story and the rest.
And everything you were talking about, because it's coming from someone who also made a feature film with literally like no money, but I was directing, producing, I even starred in it, and I wrote it and I edited it too, so I know exactly what you're talking about. I wanted to cut you off and be like, oh my god, I know what you're talking about. You know those jobs that tell you, hey, we're a family, and they obviously do not mean it. This is a community where you have to be family, and you do mean it.
Yeah, I've worked in a factory. I've had a soul sucking factory job,
I'm so sorry.
and it's okay. It's funny because it was an in between period, and I was still doing a lot of stuff creatively. So I at that point, when I was working at the factory, I started Unscripted, which is a local event, and that was back in 2013. It's still going on today. I've stepped away from it, but it's still going. I had done a film festival. We ended up getting Peter Weller, who's RoboCop, to come to that.
Holy cow.
And ultimately, Volumes of Blood came out of that period of me working in a factory. I think I was just full of rage and just ready to do something. So so I can't say it was all bad work. Well, it was all bad working in the factory, but I'm too stubborn to quit or give up. So I kept it going, and I was still doing things. But I mean, after you're up at like 3:30 in the morning to get to work by 5 o'clock, and then you're there until late in the afternoon, then you get off, and then you have to do your regular day stuff, and then you have a family. It's like it's definitely hard to keep that momentum going and find that energy. But I've somehow managed to do it, and it's paid off.
Walk us through your creative process when it comes to developing a new project.
I mean, it kind of varies. Typically, with me, I find that so my ideas usually come from nowhere. Like I'll just so for like New Fear's Eve, we were deep into production on 13 Slaves Till Christmas, and I was just driving one day, and while I was driving along, New Fear's Eve, just the title popped into my head, and I thought that's kind of a cool name. But then I start to think to myself, like, uh, so what's the story? And then I start coming up with just kind of basic elements and things. And ultimately, I'll call Eric or I'll text him and I'll say, hey, I've got this great idea for the movie, and inevitably he'll turn around and say, can we finish this movie first before we start talking about another project? So I'll put it on the shelf, or I'll just kind of keep working on it a little bit here and there. Um, but ultimately, for me, I think I'll always figure out how I want it to open in the story and how I want it to end, and then maybe I'll know a few beats in between, and then as far as like the writing process goes, I'll sit down and I'll just start pounding away, and I'll figure out, okay, so how do I get from A to B? Now, how do I get from B to C? And there's really, I'm not much of a like an artsy fartsy kind of creative person, but there's really no way to explain this without sounding artsy fartsy. But it's almost so when I start writing, and I notice a lot of other writers will agree with me when I say it like this, but it's you almost let the characters take over, and a lot of the time you find the dialogue and you find the story and the beats and the different elements through the characters. So it's almost like this weird multiple personality disorder that's kind of taking over, and
That's
then you
one way to put
allow
it.
these right, and then you allow these individuals who exist only in your mind to kind of guide you through the narrative. And what's funny is sometimes they'll do things or say things that you weren't really anticipating or expecting to pop up. And then you're like, okay, I really like this. Now I got to follow through with it to see where it's going to lead, but then also try to find my way back to what that next beat was going to be to then find my way to the conclusion. And of course, it changes and it adjusts and it evolves along the way. But but you can see what I'm saying when it's artsy fartsy, because I'm talking about these individuals who don't really exist because they're me in my head. And I, it's almost, I guess the best way I can describe it to where someone who doesn't know how, who not doesn't know, but who doesn't write is anytime you have a dream, when you're in that dream and you're having conversations with other people in the dream, you don't know what they're going to say. So it's like you're having conversations with people in the moment without knowing where that conversation is going to lead, but it's in your mind.
Right.
So how could you possibly, or how could you not possibly know what someone who's talking to you in your own head is going to say? It's like that. That's the best way I could describe it.
I think every writer would absolutely agree.
Well, I hope so, because otherwise I might be a little mentally deranged.
I call it unique, man. Before we jump into New Year's Eve and how well that film has been doing at festivals and screenings and such, which congrats, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about a film in particular that you are listed as an executive producer for, which is the horror comedy musical film called Sweetmeats. Talk to me about what this movie is and how your involvement is within the film.
Okay, so Sweetmeats ended up coming to me. I became friends with Ricky Glore, who's also another Kentucky filmmaker. He's also a comedian. And he and I had gotten to talking through social media, and he was in the process of getting ready to make another film called Open House. So I was talking to him about that, and then I got involved as an executive producer through Open House. And that was going to also be a horror comedy musical. Well, things didn't really coalesce with that project, but as with like I was saying earlier, it's like Ricky, like me, is too stubborn to stop. So he kept moving forward, put Open House over here, and then started working on a completely different project, which ultimately became Sweetmeats. And it too is a horror comedy musical. And he sent me the script, asked me if I would still like to be involved. Of course, I said yes, because like I said, I love collaboration. I love working with other filmmakers, and I love helping other filmmakers. And one of the areas, not just, I don't usually just work like in a creative capacity. The other area that I can help with a lot of the times is also promotions, because I think one of the hardest things that you can do, or one of the hardest things out there for an independent filmmaker, is getting your project recognized, or getting eyes on it, or getting it known. And I've managed to, through a lot of perseverance and bugging the shit out of media people, the press and media, I've managed to amass a wide array of connections in that area. So that's one of the things that I also offer when I'm executive producing, is like, hey, I can help you get eyes on your project. So anyway, Ricky sent me the script. I read it. I loved it. It was funny. It was original. It reminded me a lot of like Cannibal the Musical, which I absolutely love, which is ironic because ultimately Troma ended up getting involved, and Lloyd Kaufman and Michael Hers came on the project a little bit later as executive producers on the project, and ultimately Troma is going to be the one to put it out. But yeah, so ended up, because of one project, ended up working on Sweetmeats. And then I went and hung out on set when they were filming at a place called Bobby Mackey's here in Kentucky. And it's supposedly like this really haunted country Western music type of
Okay.
joint. And nothing happened while I was there. It is an extremely spooky place. I can't admit that. There's a lower level, and part of the lower level is what used to be an old slaughterhouse, and it's still standing, or was. um, I don't know if it's happened yet, but I believe that they either are planning to, or have torn down Bobby Mackey's, because they're going to rebuild on that same location. um, but the location itself has been in a bunch of ghost hunting shows. I think it was even on Ghost Adventures. And so it became infamous because of that. So he ended up needing a location like that. So a majority of the film was actually shot at Bobby Mackey's. And I got to go hang out on set, meet the cast, meet the crew. They're all a bunch of great people. We had a really good time filming. He was doing a whole bunch of kills that day. So I got to see the special effects crew, and meet them and see them work. And yeah, Ricky's a really funny guy. He's a really cool guy. He's really down to earth. And it was a fun project to be a part of. And it's right now it's in the post production phase, so it's on its way to getting totally finished. And I believe It's been sent off for, I think they're doing like the color correction and all that right now. Don't quote me on that, but I think the last time I
Cool.
spoke to them was that's what they were doing.
So hopefully sooner than later you can see Sweetmeats. But something I think is really cool back on to New Year's Eve now is obviously some of the notable names you've gotten, like Felissa Rose from Sleepaway Camp, and obviously a mutual friend of ours from Kentucky, Jeffrey Reddick. And how iconic is it to get Final Destination series creator Jeffrey Reddick in this film? And how did you get him to agree to come on board and make this magic happen?
So that process, first of all, Jeffrey is one of the most incredibly kind and generous and talented people I would say that I've met in the industry, who's
Me
working
too.
in the industry.
Hmm.
And he's there's no ego. I'm sure he has an ego, but I haven't dealt with his ego, thankfully. And because all artists have an ego, but that was, like I was saying, that was a process that began, I would say, back in 2016. So I found out that Jeffrey was from Kentucky, and just based off that little bit of information, because I'm really surprised at how many other creatives that work in the industry are from Kentucky. Like if you Wikipedia that, it's crazy. The people that I didn't realize that are from this state. So when Final Destination is one of my favorite franchises.
Me too.
And the first film being that I used to be really bad, but a hypochondriac. Um, that first movie really had like a real hardcore visceral impact on me, because it was like after I saw that, every time I woke up in the morning, I'm like, did brushing my teeth start the process of what's going to kill me at the end of the day? Um, so when I found out that Jeffrey was from Kentucky, uh, I just messaged him on Facebook and I said, "Hey, I'm a fan of your films, and I'm from Kentucky. I'm an independent filmmaker, not expecting anything."
Hmm.
And he wrote me back, and we continued to talk here and there on social media. And finally, one day, he said, "You know what? I'm barely ever on Facebook. Let me give you my email address." So he was like, I'm better through email." So we started emailing each other back and forth, and it was a lot, talking about movies, talking about concepts that I had and stuff like that. And finally, he sent me an email one day, and he goes, "Okay, we're talking so much, it's really getting annoying having to write all these emails. So let me here's my number, just call me sometime." So he gave me his number, I called him, and the rest is kind of history. And it was like after that, we started talking on the phone a lot. I would just be sitting there at home on a Saturday, and the phone would ring, and all right, Aurora, go. Sorry. Um, but so I would just be sitting there, and then my phone would ring, and I'm looking, it's Jeffrey. So I'd call, or I'd answer, and he's like, "Hey, what's going on?" And we would just shoot the breeze, and not talking about anything I was doing movie wise, any projects he had. Um, so we became friends, and then as that friendship progressed, it eventually, like I was telling him ideas for other movies. He's like, "Oh, you should write that script, or you should make that movie." And um, he's really supportive of other independent filmmakers in this area, not just myself. So he was like, "Look, one of these days we're going to work on a project together." So when 13 Slaves came around and the pandemic hit, and that's a whole other story. Um, Ultimately, I was like, "Hey, do you want to have a cameo in 13 Slaves Till Christmas?" And he said, "Sure." So of course, I sent him the script. He said, "I really like this role." He filmed it in LA. He sent me the video, and then that's why he has that cameo in 13 Slaves. The cool thing was is when the movie got done, I sent it to him, and he called me back almost immediately, and he was just going on and on and on about how great it was, how funny it was, how great everybody worked on it, how well they did, how solid the acting was, and he had a lot of praise for it. And he said, look, I know it's none of my business, but what was the budget for the film? And I told him it was like just under, it was somewhere between 15 and $20,000. He was like, oh my God, that's insane. He goes, I know people out here in LA that are making $6 million movies that don't even look half as good as what you guys made for a fraction of that. Whatever you do next, keep me up to date. I want to be a part of it, not just have a cameo or I film here, but I want to come to Kentucky. I want to be on set. I want to hang out with you. I want to hang out with Eric. So uh, when it came time to start working on New Year's Eve, I said, do you want to be a part of this? And he said, absolutely, but send me the script first. I want to read it, make sure, you're not making a porno. And I sent him the script. Once again, called me back like within a couple of days, read the script, absolutely loved it. You had me hooked from the first 10 pages. The characters are believable. The story's great, lots of emotion. It's scary. It's funny. I want to be involved. And it started out as just, he was going to come on board as a producer. And then we kind of talked about how, he was going to be coming to set, and he said, look, is there a role in here you think that I could play? And there really, at the time, in that draft, there wasn't a role for him, because he wanted something that was a bit more, he wanted a more comedic role, because a lot of the roles that he was getting at the time were really serious type roles. He said, I want to start doing something, I want something that has more comedic meat on its bones.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, I'll write you a role in the film when I do the next draft. Of course, I had to find a way to work another character in organically and that sort of a thing, but it really wasn't that difficult. And so I wrote him the role, adjusted a few things, sent him the new version of the script. He read it. He was like, I love it. I want to do it. It's great. Let's go. So then we planned to have him in the movie, and not just that. That first real big filming weekend was also the same weekend where Dave and Felissa came in to film. So that first weekend it was the last weekend of January of 2023. We had Jeffrey, we had Dave, we had Felissa, we had 23 pages to film in 2 days, and we had about 32 Indiegogo extras that all came from all over the country to be on set, to be in several scenes of the movie. And it was probably one of the most uh, difficult and stressful weekends I've ever had on a film set. But at the same time, like, not necessarily, I would say, like in a negative way, but it was definitely like there was a lot of moving parts and things. That weekend, we also did 9 kills in the movie.
Oh, wow.
And the other thing about the film is there's a little over 40 kills total. They're all practical. They're all on screen, except for maybe like 2 or 3 where it kind of cuts away and then you see the aftermath. But I hate that those kinds of special effects. I know sometimes they're necessary, and the way we do them in the film here, we find ways to work it in to where it doesn't feel like we're being cheap about it. But um, I'm a big gore hound. So anytime we're killing somebody on screen, like, I want someone to feel like their time on set being murdered
Was
was
worth it.
worth it.
Yeah.
Right. So between 9 kills, 32 extras, Dave, Felissa, Jeffrey, it was a lot happening, but it went seamlessly, and everybody seemed to really have a great time, and it went over really well. Um,
Thank you
but
for sharing that,
ultimately,
though. Yeah. Like,
oh, absolutely, yeah, and that's the thing. Like, I would, in a heartbeat, work with Jeffrey again. I mean, we're still working with him because he's a producer on the movie, so it's like I just talked to him 2 hours ago. It's not just about the movie, but we were also talking about, like,
a big goal of this podcast has always been to highlight the power of gratitude and appreciation, as well as to promote awareness of protecting our mental health, which is why an essential part of my routine is saying 3 things I'm grateful for when I wake up and before I go to bed. So, PJ, with that being said, what is one thing in particular that you're the most grateful for that you can think of right now?
I would say friends and family. I mean, I know that's technically 2 things,
That's okay.
but but between because unfortunately, towards the tail end of shooting New Year's Eve, I lost my mom. So
So
that brought
sorry.
me even Thank you. That brought me even closer to my stepdad, or really, he's my dad. Like he helped raise me, and then of course my fiance Leslie, who is the Leslie in New Year's Eve, is modeled after the real Leslie. And we're getting married in September.
Congrats.
And thank you, and she's incredibly supportive, and does she doesn't get in the way of any of this, and she wants this to be successful, and it's a totally different kind of scenario than what I'm used to. So I would say that's ultimately that's everything, and of course Eric, because he's one of the best partners I've ever had in terms of working on films. So it's definitely the people in my life.
And thank you so much for giving me your time today, man. Tell us anything else you might have to promote, anything you may have coming up, and tell us where everyone can find you.
Easiest way to get in touch with me is Facebook. You can go to bloodmoonpictures.com to find out more about our projects. July 5th, 6th, and 7th, particularly the 6th, we're going to be in Indianapolis at Days of the Dead. We have a screening of New Year's Eve. We just got accepted into Horror Hound, which is September 13th, 14th, and 15th in, I'm brain farting, but it's, yeah, sorry, I'm brain farting
Oh, it's
on
all
where
good.
Horror Hound is at, but it's Cincinnati. It's in Cincinnati. So yeah, there's that's another opportunity to check it out. And we have a whole slew of other film festivals that we're waiting to hear back from, and we're also working on distribution. So hopefully we'll get something nailed down before the end of the year, and we can get this thing out there for everybody to take a look at.
I will drop the socials below, but follow me on Twitter at David Clair B, and this is the Real Appreciation Podcast. I'm David Clair-Bennett, and you are PJ Starks. Check out New Year's Eve, and we are out.